was Japan's take on the European hatchback, and it was also one of the best, most sleeper-ish, that is a word, JDM cars of all time. But don't let that distract you from the fact that Hector is running 3 Honda Civics with spoon engines, T66 turbos, with NOS, and a Motec system exhaust. Whatever that is. Before we can explore the Honda Civic, we have to understand where Honda came from. Soichiro Honda grew Honda Motors out of World War II with the S800 sports car and their Formula One program. Yeah, for a brief period in time, Honda was the Ferrari of Japan. They only made Formula One cars and sports cars. And a small little micro truck. That was Honda, not Ferrari. But as Soichiro Honda's influence in the company started to dwindle, they decided to focus on the more economically minded K-car industry. However, it was only economically minded in Japan, and while that worked for the first few years, it was a little difficult to try and branch out into other markets, given that the K cars are so small and slow, they are virtually impossible to sell anywhere other than a big city. And even then, most European and American cities don't want something that tiny. So Honda decided to sell a microcar that's a little bit bigger than a K car. And it was brutally simple. They took the N600 chassis and simply increased the dimensions. And then they decided to add such luxury amenities like a faux wood trim, optional air conditioning and radio systems, and a 2-speed semi-automatic gearbox. But there were a few reasons for this. First, it was cheap, anyone could afford it. Second, it was light, just 1,500 pounds. And third, that weight came in handy when its 1.2-liter 4-cylinder made 50 horsepower, but it got 50 mpg. And they saved money on the amenities for sure, but they put that money into the most important stuff. The handling. This thing was a little go-kart. It came standard with front disc brakes, fully independent front and rear suspension, and an optional 4-speed manual gearbox. Like the Mazda MX-5, it wasn't fast, but it was a fun car in the twisties. And more importantly for Honda and the sales department, it launched at the absolute perfect time in 1972, because 6 months later, the gas crisis gripped America. Now all of these big V8 boats were way too expensive to run and way too filthy to pass new emission regulations without a horsepower-choking catalytic converter. But Honda had an ace up its sleeve, the CVCC engine, which was specifically designed to meet emissions without a catalytic converter, which meant it was cheaper and it allowed for more efficient combustion. They sold 1 million of them before they were all recalled. Apparently, small things like the fenders, and the front suspension arms, and the front crossbeam, and the strut towers were incredibly rust-prone. Honda had to repair or buy back over 930,000 rusty Civics in the largest safety recall in American auto history up to that point. Which is a bit of a shame because it overshadowed the first-gen Civic's best moment, the 1200 RS. You see, in 1974, over the course of 12 months, 20,000 JDM Civics were upgraded into the road sailing spec. This meant it got stiffer springs, a new 5-speed gearbox, a more aggressive cam, free-flowing intake manifolds, higher compression pistons, and a new carburetor to boost horsepower up to 75 horsepower and 74 foot-pounds of torque. It took the already brilliant little go-kart and gave it just a little bit more punch, a little bit more spring in its step. But again, it was overshadowed by the rusty Hondas, and no one took notice of one of the original hot hatchbacks. So we move on to the 1980s with the second generation, and like most second generation designs, it was pretty much here's how we fix all the problems of the first gen. First, it didn't rust, that's a good thing. Then the 2-speed gearbox was ditched in favor of a 3-speed, and it came in a sedan and a Woody, guys. Which is fun, cause Woody. It also got even better gas mileage with an average MPG of 47 in California. And it was the first Civic generation to be graced with an S model, for the first time in 1983, which made 69 horsepower. And the third gen Civic followed suit. It brought the Civic properly into the 80s with amazing boxy styling, with a lot of versions that were very strange. There was a shuttle wagon variant, which introduced all-wheel drive, and a low-range gearbox and raised suspension. There you go. Then there was the rebadging done around the globe. I'm not lying when I said there were a lot of versions of this. It was spun off as the Triumph Acclaim and the Rover 213 in Europe, and it was built by Mercedes-Benz in South Africa. More you know. It also got a neat 2-door coupe version called the CRX, which looks awesome, but it really isn't much different underneath, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. It's just a bit more fun, sporty version, at least in appearance, than the Civic, in case you didn't want to have a boring hatchback in the 80s. Meanwhile, the 5-door hatchback version was spun off in Japan into this little car called the Integra. Yeah, just like how Volkswagen spun the Jetta off from previous Volkswagen models, this launched several Honda and Acura models that we know to this day. It also launched the Civic Si, which was the first time an SI badge appeared on the Civic in 1985. This meant a new rear stabilizer bar improved the handling, while a new 3-valve per cylinder engine made 91 horsepower through all 4 cylinders, and it had a tiny little spoiler to match the fantastic handling. It could hit 60 in under 9 seconds, and the only hatchback faster was the Shelby Omni GLHS. That's pretty damn impressive. The same cannot be said for the Civic as a whole. There was nothing wrong with the 4th and 5th generation Civics. They were very good vehicles, but they weren't exactly exciting. They were very mundane family vehicles, which is what they were supposed to be, so they did a great job on that, but they were a bit normal. So we're going to fast forward to 1995 with the 6th generation, and focus primarily on the ultra-high performance versions that will be coming later, because the Civic can get very boring very quickly if you talk about the base models. So we started out with the SIR in 1995. It took the VTEC engine introduced in the 5th generation, tuned it up to 160 horsepower at 8,000 RPM, and again, sure, that's not a lot, but it's a 2,600-pound front-wheel drive hatchback, and it was great handling, but Honda did have an answer for you power-hungry crazies. Honda wanted to answer the question, what if you wanted to race your Civic? So what they came up with was the first super hot hatch, the EK9 Type R. Like the Integra Type R, it was stripped of all non-essentials, all the way down to 2,300-pound curb weight. Then they seam-welded the chassis for more rigidity, fitted lighter, more supportive Recaro bucket seats, a limited slip differential, a close ratio gearbox, and the legendary B16B engine. It was a 1.6-liter, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder making 160 horsepower, which was the most powerful naturally aspirated carb per liter in the world until Honda's own S2000. And it was a very strong engine. The internals were tuned up by Spoon, a little Honda tuning shop that deserves a video on its own sometime later, that could rev up to 11,000 RPM. The normal version, thanks to its red accents, that's clearly the thing that made it go fast, could hit 60 in 6.7 seconds and a top speed of 140 miles an hour. That is fast by today's standards. This is an incredible car. Small wonder this is arguably the most revered and valuable Civic of all time, despite its very large 16,000 unit production. And it carried itself all the way to the 7th generation Civic in the year 2000. Both the SIR and the Type R were brought back. And this time, the Type R was available outside of Japan. It was available in Europe as well. Sadly, not America's, because we never get anything interesting. But I'm kind of glad we didn't get this one, because they didn't fit the LSD in it, and they fitted softer suspension and steering. Sure, they fixed it in 2003, but why they did this I will never understand. Except in Japan, where they got all the good stuff in its brilliant normal self, this time making over 200 horsepower. And it was a sad day in the 8th generation Civic 5 years later. The SIR was gone, which meant that we had to make do with a normal Civic Si. Although Honda did make up for it by making the Type R a sedan, which is awesome, but only in Japan. In Europe, they got this weird egg little thing. I'm not going to say it looks very good. I think it actually looks quite hideous. They were perfectly fine. They weren't anything special. They were getting heavier. It was almost at 3,000 pounds, and it sort of felt like the lightweight nimbleness was gone. And then, just like that, in 2011, the Type R was gone altogether. And it would stay gone for another 4 years, where we had the SI in the 9th generation, which was a very good car, make no mistake. It was as fast as some of the previous Type Rs as the rate of technology progression, but fans were craving a new Type R, and finally, in 2015, Honda debuted the FK2 alongside the new NSX at the Geneva Motor Show. It was controversial, for sure, the first 3,000 pound plus Civic Type R, and the first turbocharged Type R, but it had a great differential and 300 horsepower. It was blisteringly fast. Ironically, the engine was built in Ohio and then exported to production lines around the world. And for you Civic trivia fans, the Type R wasn't sold in America, so the engine was built in America for a car we couldn't have, despite the fact that the WRX had been in America for a while, and the new Focus RS was just debuted, so clearly Americans like hatchbacks, to an extent anyway. But that all changed in 2017 when the 10th generation FK8 Type R debuted worldwide. Once you got past the questionable rear end, the fake vents, and the bumpy ride, you realized this thing was ready to make mincemeat of global competition. The engine and the differential were already great in the FK2, so in order to translate that 306 horsepower stubbornly through the front wheels, without torque steer, because that is the biggest problem with a front-wheel drive car. They had to do this, the front wheels had to do the steering and the accelerating in one swoop. Honda tuned the suspension so you could beautifully clip every single apex of Silverstone without running wide and crashing. This was a masterclass of engineering and performance, and it was ready to demolish front-wheel drive lap records. It set records at Bathurst, Spa, Silverstone, Suzuka, and of course, the Nürburgring. This was a front-wheel drive hatchback, which did a 7-minute and 43-second lap of the ring, which is faster than a Pagani Zonda R, and the only thing that is faster than it that is front-wheel drive is the $80,000 Renault Megane carbon fiber race car thing. That's incredibly impressive. And I know I mentioned and joked about the controversial looks. I quite like them. This is a bit more of a teenager type yabo, young person fun car, and I think the styling matches it beautifully. They could have toned it down a bit for sure, but I still really like the look of this car. Which brings me to the 11th gen, and I think the looks have carried over quite nicely. It looks pretty good. The most recent Civic was released June of this year, and both the SI and the Type R have been confirmed to return. The former of which is slated to be a sedan only, and there have been spy shots of a very angry Type R that are in camo, and it has a massive wing, just like the previous, but it's even crazier. I think it's going to be an absolute weapon. Whether it'll be front-wheel drive, I expect it will be. That's sort of Honda's bread and butter, is a front-wheel drive super hot hatch in an era of all-wheel drive super hot hatches like the Focus RS and the Mercedes A45 and the Audi S3? S1? I don't know. I think it's a good refresher to have a good old-fashioned front-wheel drive hot hatch. And it's scheduled for a release in 2022. So Honda has a pretty impressive track record to keep up, and, well, given the release date is 2022, I can't imagine we'll have to wait much longer for it to be revealed.